I remember the day as if it were branded into my mind. The sky was bright and cloudless, one of those crisp mornings where the world feels steady and predictable. I had my leather checkbook in one pocket and my bank card in the other. I wasn't doing anything unusual. I simply needed to withdraw cash to pay the contractor who was working on repairing the old fence around my backyard. I had done this dozens of times before. I walked into the bank expecting it to be another ordinary errand in a string of ordinary days. When I reached the counter, I handed my card to the young teller, a woman who always greeted me kindly. She swiped the card, her practiced smile still in place, and typed in a few numbers. Then her expression shifted. First confusion, fidgetetch. She looked at her screen a little too long, as though reading something she didn't want to repeat out loud. Finally, she said in a soft voice, "I'm sorry, Mr. Harrison, but your account has been restricted. I can't release any funds to you today." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. Restricted? My account? I had well over a lifetime's worth of savings in there. Money I had worked for, earned honestly, and put away carefully. I chuckled awkwardly, thinking maybe it was a simple bank error. "That can't be right," I told her. "Check again. I need to withdraw $800, nothing more." But her hands froze above the keyboard. Her face tightened with discomfort. She glanced at the manager across the lobby, and he made his way over. The other customers in line were shifting, impatient, curious. Suddenly, I wasn't just another man running errands. I was a spectacle. The manager spoke to me in that careful, condescending tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news to a child. "Mr. Harrison, I'm afraid we have a note on your account. You've been flagged under a protective measure. We can't allow transactions without further clearance." "Protective measure," I repeated, feeling heat rise in my chest. "What does that even mean? It's my money. Who are you protecting me from?" He leaned closer, lowering his voice but not enough to save me from the whispers forming behind me in line. "Your family submitted documentation claiming you may no longer be capable of managing your finances independently. Until this is cleared, the bank has frozen your accounts." The words landed like blows to my ribs. My family, my own blood, my children who had grown up in a house I worked 2 jobs to pay off. The ones who ate dinners I often skipped so they could have enough on their plates. They had gone to the bank, my bank, and told them I wasn't competent enough to handle my own money. I laughed once, sharply, almost desperately. "That's absurd. Look at me. I'm fine. I've never missed a payment. I've never bounced a check. You know me. You've seen me here for years." But rules were rules, and the manager shook his head. "Until this is resolved, I can't authorize any withdrawals. I'm truly sorry." The lobby seemed to shrink around me. People in line tried not to stare but couldn't help themselves. I felt stripped bare, humiliated in a place where I'd always held my head high. I could almost hear the unspoken judgments. "Poor old man. Must be losing it. How sad." I walked out of that bank empty-handed, my card still burning in my palm. Outside, the sunlight had turned harsh, like a spotlight exposing every flaw. My legs felt heavier with each step toward the parking lot. The thought spun in my head like a broken record. How could they do this to me? By the time I reached my car, anger had replaced shock. My family hadn't just betrayed me privately. They had taken a knife to my independence, cutting me down in public for strangers to witness. They had turned me into someone who had to be protected, a man unfit to hold his own wallet. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. Memories of working late nights at the auto shop, saving every extra dollar, paying for braces, school trips, and eventually college tuition. Everything I had done for them flashed through my mind. And this was the repayment? To have my accounts frozen under the lie that I had lost my mind. The worst part wasn't the money, though that stung badly enough. It was the label, mentally incompetent. As if I was nothing more than a doddering fool, a burden needing supervision. I had always carried myself with dignity. My word mattered in my community, my handshake meant something, and in one morning my own family had stripped me of that respect with a few signatures and a fabricated story. I sat there in the car, staring at the bank's glass doors, my reflection faintly visible against them. I knew at that moment my life had changed. I was no longer just a father or a grandfather. I had become their pawn, someone they thought they could move off the board whenever it suited them. But as humiliation settled into a cold determination, another thought formed. They believed freezing my accounts would silence me, make me powerless. They believed I'd roll over confused and defeated. What they didn't know was that they had awakened something in me. They had taken my money, but they hadn't taken my resolve. And as I turned the key in the ignition, I made a silent vow. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. When I drove home from the bank that day, the silence in the car felt heavier than the roar of an engine ever could. My hands gripped the steering wheel, but my mind replayed every detail of what had just happened. The teller's nervous glance, the manager's hushed voice, the way strangers behind me shifted in line. They all saw me as something less than a man capable of managing his own life. But the real humiliation came later, when the effects of that frozen account started bleeding into my daily routine. That evening I stopped by the local hardware store to pick up supplies for the fence repairs. I knew the contractor was coming the next day, and I didn't want to seem unprepared. I had my debit card ready, but when the cashier swiped it, the same cold words appeared on the screen. Declined. The machine spat my card back out as if it were tainted. The cashier gave me that polite but pitying look, the kind that slices deeper than cruelty. "Would you like to try another card, sir?" she asked. Behind me, 2 younger men were waiting in line. I could feel their smirks before I even turned my head. They didn't need to say it. I could hear their thoughts. Poor old guy. Probably forgot his PIN. Doesn't even know how to use his own bank account. I forced a smile that hurt to wear. "No thank you. I'll come back another time." I left the supplies sitting on the counter, my head pounding as I walked past those smirks. For the first time in my life I felt like I wasn't being seen as a man anymore, but as a shadow of one. The shame followed me home. When my neighbor Mrs. Green waved from across the yard, I couldn't bring myself to wave back. All I could think was, what if she's heard? What if she thinks I've lost my mind too? Small towns talk, and I knew how fast rumors traveled. It didn't take long before the whispers reached me directly. At church that Sunday, a man I'd known for 30 years patted me on the shoulder. "If you ever need help with your finances, don't be embarrassed to ask," he said with a sympathetic smile. He thought he was being kind, but the words burned like acid. Help with my finances. I had built a nest egg that could support my children and their children, and now I was being pitied like a helpless fool. Even my grandchildren noticed. One afternoon, my eldest granddaughter asked, "Grandpa, why can't you buy us ice cream anymore?" She didn't mean harm, children don't, but her words cut deeper than any adult's judgment. I had always been the dependable one, the man who could provide a treat, fix a broken toy, or pay the bills without hesitation. Now I was the grandfather who couldn't even buy a cone of ice cream. That night I sat at my kitchen table with my checkbook open, staring at the empty columns. I still had income from my pension, but it was locked away, frozen, inaccessible, like I was some kind of criminal, or worse, a child needing supervision. The betrayal wasn't just in what my family had done, it was in how the world now looked at me because of it. I realized something then. Money wasn't just paper or numbers in a bank account. It was independence. It was dignity. It was the ability to look another man in the eye and know you stood on equal ground. Without access to it, people began treating me like I was broken, even though my mind had never been clearer. The exclusion became unavoidable. I wasn't invited to family dinners as often anymore. When I did attend, conversations would stop when I walked in the room and I caught the sideways glances. They talked around me as though I wasn't capable of following the thread. It was like being a ghost in my own bloodline. One evening, my son had the audacity to say, "Dad, maybe it's for the best. You don't need to worry about bills anymore. We've got it covered." He said it as if he were doing me a favor, but the tone was final, patronizing, as if I had already stepped off the stage of life, and he was now the main act. I went to bed that night staring at the ceiling, the weight of humiliation pressing on my chest. They thought they had stripped me of power. They thought by freezing my accounts they had frozen me. But what they didn't realize was that shame has a way of sharpening a man's will. I knew then that I could not let this continue. I would not live out my remaining years as a man. Whispered about in church pews, pitied in stores, and dismissed at family tables. I had been humiliated, yes, but humiliation can turn into fire, and that fire had just begun to burn. When people look at me now, they don't see the miles on my hands or the decades of sweat that built the foundation under their feet. They just see an older man, someone they can sideline with a few legal documents and a signature. But I know my story, and I remember every sacrifice that brought us here. I wasn't born with money. My father died young, and I learned early that if I wanted something, I had to earn it. By 16, I was working evenings at a local mechanic's shop, knuckles scraped raw, shirt stained with oil. I remember counting crumpled bills in my bedroom at night, proud of every dollar because it meant food on the table for my mother and little sister. Those were the years when I learned what responsibility felt like. Not just the word responsibility that sat heavy on your shoulders and never let go. When I married my wife, Carol, I promised her a life better than the one I'd had. We moved into a small rental house with peeling paint and a broken porch swing, but it was ours. I worked days at the auto shop and nights driving a delivery truck. Carol took in sewing to add a few extra dollars. We didn't have much, but we built a home out of it. Laughter in the kitchen, birthday candles on the table, lullabies in the bedrooms. Every time I held one of my newborn children, I thought of the future. Not my future, but theirs. I knew life wouldn't hand them anything easily, so I swore to be the buffer between them and hardship. I wanted them to go to school without worrying about lunch money. I wanted them to dream bigger than paychecks and overdue bills. So I pushed myself harder than any man should. There were years when I barely saw daylight outside of work. The auto shop kept me until sundown, and the delivery route stole my weekends. My body ached, my back stiffened, but I told myself it was worth it. When my kids needed braces, I skipped doctor visits for myself. When they wanted to join sports teams, I drove rusty old cars so I could pay their fees. I still remember the Christmas when I wrapped up hand-me-down toys I'd fixed with spare parts, just so they could see something under the tree. Slowly, the sacrifices stacked up into something solid. By my 40s, I managed to buy a modest house, not flashy, but ours. I spent evenings fixing the roof, patching walls, mowing the lawn after long shifts. My kids would play in the yard, their voices carrying across the grass, and I told myself this was why the pain in my knees was worth it. I saved every dollar I could. I never went on vacations, rarely bought new clothes, and never splurged on luxuries. While my friends bought boats or took trips, I put money away into savings and retirement accounts. I told my children, this is for you. One day this money will mean you won't struggle the way I did. College came, and I paid tuition with cash I'd set aside instead of taking trips I'd dreamed of. I still see myself standing in the bursar's office, handing over checks while my son grinned about his future. I smiled back, even though I knew it meant I'd be working overtime another year just to cover the hole in my own finances. And then came the medical bills for Carol. When she got sick, I didn't hesitate. I drained accounts, sold the old pickup, canceled projects around the house. None of it mattered if she wasn't by my side. I sat in hospital chairs, holding her hand, praying the money would stretch long enough to keep her alive. We fought together, but in the end, she slipped away. That loss nearly broke me, but it also lit a deeper fire. I couldn't let her sacrifices and mine go to waste. I told myself I would keep building, keep saving, keep protecting. My children needed stability, and I would give it to them no matter the cost. So when the house was finally paid off, when the retirement accounts had grown to something meaningful, when the savings had stacked high enough to cover any storm, I thought I had reached a place of peace. I thought I had fulfilled my promise to Carol, to myself, and most of all to the children who had grown into adults with families of their own. What I never imagined, what I couldn't have prepared for, was that the very people I had broken my body for, the ones who slept peacefully because I carried the weight, would turn around and use my devotion against me, that they would twist my sacrifices into weakness, rewriting my story as one of incompetence instead of resilience. Every scar on my hands, every ache in my bones, every dollar saved, it wasn't just money, it was proof of my worth, proof of my love. And now as I sit here remembering those long nights and endless sacrifices, I feel the sting of betrayal all over again. Because when my family convinced the bank I was mentally incompetent, they weren't just freezing my accounts, they were erasing my sacrifices. They were taking the story I had written in sweat and struggle and rewriting it as a tragedy I never authored. That's the part that cut deepest. Not the money itself, but the idea that my life's work could be dismissed with a few signed papers, that everything I had done, every sacrifice, could be turned into evidence against me. But here's the truth they don't know yet. Those sacrifices weren't chains. They were the steel that forged me. And if they think they can bury me under the weight of their lies, they've forgotten one thing. I've carried heavier burdens before, and I survived them all. The hardest part wasn't just losing access to my money. It was hearing how my own flesh and blood described me to others. To the bank, to neighbors, to anyone who would listen. They didn't just freeze my accounts, they rewrote who I was. I first caught wind of it from a neighbor. Old Mr. Connors waved me down one morning while I was bringing in the trash bins. He hesitated, cleared his throat, then said, "If you ever need a ride to the doctor, don't be too proud to ask. Folks your age sometimes get forgetful." Forgetful? I stood there stunned. I'd never missed a doctor's appointment. My memory was sharp. I could tell you the exact mileage on the first car I bought 40 years ago. But when I pressed him, he mumbled something about my children being concerned about my health. That was the first time I realized they were planting seeds of doubt in the community. Not long after, a church member approached me after service. "It's a blessing your kids are looking out for you," she said kindly. "I hear they're taking care of your finances now, just so you don't get overwhelmed." Overwhelmed. That word stung worse than any insult. I had balanced checkbooks in my sleep. I had managed mortgages, tuition, and medical bills for decades. I was the one people came to for advice. Now I was being painted as someone too frail to understand his own bank statement. When I finally got copies of the documents my children submitted to the bank, my stomach turned. The language was clinical, cold, and designed to strip me of dignity. Mr. Harrison has shown signs of confusion. He sometimes forgets conversations. He appears to be incapable of making sound financial decisions. They wrote about me like I was already halfway gone, a man too lost in his own mind to function. They described moments that never happened, me leaving bills unpaid, me asking the same question repeatedly, me showing signs of paranoia. None of it was true. It was a portrait painted with lies, each brushstroke designed to convince strangers that I was no longer myself. And the worst part, it worked. The bank believed them. Friends began treating me differently. Even relatives from out of town called with hushed voices asking, "Are you doing okay? Do you need someone to check in on you?" I wanted to shout at them, "I'm fine, I'm sharper than ever." But the doubt had already spread. I began to notice the way my own children spoke to me. My son would slow down his words, as if I couldn't follow a normal pace. My daughter would repeat things twice, using that syrupy tone people use with toddlers. And when I asked about my accounts, they brushed me off. "Dad, don't stress yourself. Just let us handle it." It wasn't concern. It was control. They wanted my years of savings, my home, my security. And the easiest way to take it wasn't by force. It was by convincing the world that I didn't deserve it anymore. What hurt the most was remembering the times I had defended them. The times teachers said they were struggling, and I worked extra hours to pay for tutors. The times they messed up in high school, and I stood before principals taking the blame for not being home enough. I carried their mistakes so they could walk free, and now in return they carried lies about me to strip away my freedom. I thought back to the words in those documents. Signs of confusion. Maybe they mistook silence for confusion. Maybe they mistook my patience for weakness. But I knew what was happening. They weren't worried about me losing my mind. They were worried about losing their chance to grab what I had built before I was gone. At first, the false narrative made me question myself. I caught myself double-checking my sentences, making sure I didn't forget a name or misplace my keys. Every time I paused and thought, I wondered if they were right. Was I slipping? Was I the fool they painted me as? But then I remembered the sacrifices, the decades of sharp decisions that had kept this family afloat, the nights of balancing every dollar until it stretched, the countless choices that required clarity, not confusion. If I had been incompetent, none of them would have the lives they live today. No, the truth was clear. They weren't protecting me. They were protecting their own greed. And if they thought their false narrative would bury me under shame, they were mistaken. Because I wasn't confused. I wasn't weak. I wasn't finished. There's a point in every storm when shouting into the wind does nothing. The harder you fight against it, the more it shoves you down. That was the realization that came to me after weeks of humiliation, weeks of being treated like a helpless old man. I wanted to scream at my children, to demand answers, to pound my fists on the bank counter until someone finally listened. But rage alone wasn't going to get my life back. So I went quiet. Not defeated quiet. Strategic quiet. At first, silence came naturally because I was too angry to trust my own words. The bitterness sat so close to the surface that one wrong syllable might explode into a storm I couldn't pull back from. But after a few days of keeping to myself, I noticed something. People assumed silence meant surrender. They mistook my stillness for resignation, my calm for acceptance. And that gave me space. Space to watch, to listen, and to plan. My son would drop by with that fake concern plastered on his face. He'd ask if I was feeling clear today, or if I remembered to eat lunch. I bit back the urge to throw him out. Instead, I nodded, played along, and let him think he was in control. The more he believed I was slipping, the less careful he was with his words. And in his carelessness, I started catching fragments of his intentions. Talk about future plans, about the house being too much for me to manage. My daughter called less often, but when she did, her voice dripped with the same patronizing tone. "Dad, don't worry about bills anymore. We'll take care of everything." I thanked her, keeping my voice even, though the words tasted like poison. Silence gave her confidence to say more than she should, and what she said painted a picture. This wasn't about protecting me at all. It was about carving up what I had worked for before I was even gone. The false narrative they'd spun, that I was confused, incapable, worked in my favor when I leaned into it. If they wanted to see me as slow, I let them. If they thought I was too tired to push back, I gave them that illusion. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, my mind worked sharper than ever. I began writing things down. Every conversation, every odd comment, every slip of the tongue. I recorded it in a notebook I kept hidden in the drawer of my nightstand. If my memory was ever questioned, I would have a written trail to prove otherwise. I also started digging through my old files. I pulled out decades worth of bank statements, property deeds, tax records. They thought freezing my accounts would leave me powerless, but they had forgotten about the paperwork I'd stored away like treasure over the years. I stacked it neatly, organized it, and marked every place where my name stood alone, free of their signatures or claims. Silence became my shield, but it was also my weapon. In conversations with neighbors, I stopped defending myself. I didn't deny or explain. Instead, I smiled faintly and changed the subject. The less I fought their rumors, the less people looked at me like a man desperate to prove his sanity. And slowly, I noticed the whispers losing energy. If I wasn't fuming or panicking, maybe the story wasn't as true as it had seemed. But silence also gave me something else: time to think about who I could trust. I had always been a man who carried my own weight, but this was a battle that required allies. The question was, who still believed in me? Who still saw me for the man I had always been, not the helpless version painted by my children? I didn't answer that question right away. I knew better than to move too soon. Instead, I kept observing. Each visit from my children became less about family and more about surveillance. They'd glance at the bills on my counter, peek into my refrigerator, check the mail stacked by the door. They thought they were assessing my decline, but I knew they were measuring how much longer until they could justify taking more. That fueled me more than anger ever could. Because while they measured my supposed weakness, I was measuring their greed. At night, I'd sit at the kitchen table, the same table where I once taught them how to do math homework, and I'd lay out my notes. I traced the pattern of their behavior like a map. Lies here, greed there, a plan forming in the middle. And every night as I closed the notebook, I whispered the same thing to myself. Not yet. Wait. Strategic silence isn't easy. It eats at you, knowing the world sees you as weak while you hold your strength close to your chest. There were nights I wanted to slam my fist through the wall, to call the bank president myself and demand justice. But deep down I knew timing mattered. A man who rushes into battle with nothing but rage loses. A man who waits, who chooses his moment, who builds his case quietly, that man wins. So I let them underestimate me. I let them think I was drifting away, and every time they dismissed me, every time they called me confused or overwhelmed, I smiled to myself, because I wasn't confused, I wasn't overwhelmed, I was preparing. The silence they thought was weakness was the very thing sharpening me. And soon enough they'd learn what I had always known: the quietest man in the room is often the most dangerous. Silence was only the first step. A man can't stay quiet forever if he means to win. Quiet has to lead to action, and for me, that action began with proof. My children thought words would be enough. A few lies in official-sounding documents, some carefully chosen phrases about confusion and forgetfulness, and suddenly the bank had clipped my wings. But words are slippery. Paper, on the other hand, is solid, and I knew I had paper. I started with the boxes in my attic. Most men might have tossed out old records decades ago, but not me. Every tax return, every mortgage payment receipt, every utility bill, I had kept them all. At first I thought it was habit, maybe stubbornness. Now I realized it was insurance. I pulled those boxes down one by one, the dust thick on their lids, and began to sort. I found decades of consistency. Every check signed clearly in my hand. Every bill paid on time. Bank statements that showed not a single overdraft, not a single suspicious withdrawal. I stacked them in neat piles on my dining room table, the evidence of a lifetime of clear-headed decisions. Next I called my doctor. Not my children's doctor, the one they had used to write glowing reports about their own health. My doctor. The man who had seen me for 20 years. I told him the truth, that my children were claiming I was mentally unfit. He was shocked, almost offended. "You've never shown signs of cognitive decline, Mr. Harrison," he said firmly. "I'll write you a statement myself." Within days I had a signed letter from him certifying that my memory and decision-making were intact. That letter went straight into the growing pile of evidence. I also reached out to my old accountant. She had retired but still remembered me well. When I explained what was happening, she didn't hesitate. "You've been one of the sharpest clients I ever had," she said. "Never missed a deduction, never once confused about your accounts." She mailed me a summary letter, stamped with her signature, vouching for my financial competence. Another stone added to the wall I was building. But proof alone wasn't enough. I needed leverage, something that reminded my children that while they were playing games with paperwork, I still had the upper hand in ways they hadn't considered. That's when I reviewed my property deeds. The house they assumed would one day be theirs was in fact mine alone. Their names weren't on it. The same was true for a piece of land I had bought quietly years earlier. A small investment I never told them about. It wasn't worth millions, but it was mine, tucked away safely, out of their reach. I copied those deeds and placed them with the rest of my records. My children had frozen one account, but they hadn't frozen everything. They assumed they had locked me in a cage, but they'd overlooked the keys I'd hidden in plain sight. Then I did something unexpected. I opened a new notebook. On the first page I wrote, "For the bank." On the second page, "For the court." And on the third, For them. Under each heading I began listing what I had: evidence for the bank to unfreeze my accounts, legal proof in case I needed to fight this in court, and leverage, assets, deeds, and secrets that would remind my family I wasn't the helpless man they thought I was. The more I gathered, the lighter I felt. With every piece of proof, the false narrative they had built began to crack. They thought they had buried me under lies, but I was digging out with every scrap of paper, every signature, every record that carried my name with dignity intact. And still I stayed quiet. I didn't let them know what I was building. I smiled when they visited, let them talk down to me, let them believe they were winning. All the while, I was stacking evidence like ammunition, preparing for the day I would fire it all back at them in one decisive shot. Because betrayal has a short memory, but proof lasts forever, and soon I would remind them of that. It's a strange thing, fighting your own blood. Strangers can wound you, but betrayal from family cuts in a place deeper than bone. For weeks I carried that wound in silence, hiding it behind polite smiles and nods while I stacked proof in the shadows of my home. But even the strongest man knows that battles aren't won alone. I had proof, I had leverage, but what I didn't have was someone in my corner who could speak when I couldn't. Someone who could stand beside me when the lies grew too loud. That's when I thought of David Whitman. David had been my lawyer years ago, back when Carol and I bought our first house. He was younger then, sharp-eyed, ambitious, and relentless in the courtroom. Over the years, I watched him build a reputation not just for his skill but for his integrity. He wasn't the type of man to bend for money or favors, and he had always spoken to me with respect, never once treating me like the poor mechanic who scraped every dollar together. I hadn't spoken to him in a long time, but something inside told me he was the one I needed now, so I called his office. When his secretary patched me through, I half expected him to sound distant or too busy to remember me. Instead, his voice warmed instantly. "Mr. Harrison, it's been years. How are you holding up?" For a moment my throat tightened. Here was a man greeting me like the person I had always been, not the confused fool my children described. "David," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I need your help. My children, they've convinced the bank I'm mentally incompetent." There was silence on the line, then a sharp edge in his tone. "That's a serious claim. Do you have proof otherwise?" I almost laughed. "David, I've spent weeks gathering it. Medical records, financial documents, statements from people who know me. I just need someone who knows the system." He didn't hesitate. "Bring everything to my office. We'll go through it together." When I arrived the next day, I carried 2 heavy folders under my arm. David met me in the lobby, shaking my hand firmly, looking me straight in the eye. That handshake mattered more than he realized. It was the first time in months someone had treated me as capable, as strong, as myself. We sat down in his office and I laid out everything. He flipped through the papers methodically, nodding, scribbling notes. When he read my doctor's letter, he actually smiled. "This is solid, and this accountant's statement, that's gold. They can't argue with decades of professional testimony." I watched him, hope flickering back to life. For so long I'd been painted as weak, my voice drowned out by lies. But here was a man who didn't just believe me, he respected me enough to take my fight seriously. "Mr. Harrison," he said finally, closing the folder, "your children may have thought they were clever, but they've overplayed their hand. Banks are cautious, but they don't like liability. If we present this properly, not only will your accounts be reinstated, but we can push for accountability. What they've done borders on fraud." The word hit me like a spark. Fraud. That's what it was. Not concern, not care. Fraud. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized I wasn't the one on trial. They were. David leaned forward, his eyes steady on mine. "You're not alone in this. I'll stand with you, but you have to trust me. Keep playing the part. Let them believe you're silent and subdued. Meanwhile, we'll prepare everything." I nodded, my chest tight with a mix of relief and determination. Here, finally, was my ally. But David wasn't the only one. A week later, I got a call from someone I never expected. Rachel Green, my neighbor's daughter. She was a banker at a different branch, and she had grown up watching me fix cars in my driveway, waving every time she rode her bike past my house. "Mr. Harrison," she said gently, "I heard what happened with your accounts. I don't believe the rumors. I know you. You've always been steady." Those words, simple as they were, nearly undid me. She didn't owe me anything. She had no stake in my life. But she saw through the lies. "I can't interfere directly," she continued, "but I can tell you this. Banks have to document every claim. If your family submitted statements, they're on file. You're entitled to see what was said about you. Don't let them hide behind whispers." That tip was exactly what I needed. With David's help, we requested the full file. When it arrived, thick and heavy, I saw in black and white the words my children had written about me. Fabrications, exaggerations, complete distortions of reality. It was painful, but it was also empowering, because now the lies weren't just rumors floating in the air. They were written down, signed, and ready to be dismantled piece by piece. Between David's legal expertise and Rachel's inside knowledge, I finally had an army, small though it was, and that was enough. Because an ally isn't measured by numbers, it's measured by conviction. For the first time since walking out of that bank empty-handed, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own life. I felt like a man sharpening his blade with others by his side. The humiliation, the whispers, the false narrative, they had all pushed me into silence. But now, with allies beside me, silence no longer felt like defeat, it felt like preparation. And when the time came to confront them, I would no longer be standing alone. The moment had been building for months. I had played the part of the subdued father, the confused man they believed they had written into existence. I had listened, nodded, and stayed quiet while they spoke about me, as though I weren't sitting in the same room. But silence only lasts so long. A man can stay patient while he builds his case, but eventually, there comes a day when he has to stand. My day came on a Tuesday morning in David Whitman's office, with a stack of evidence on his desk and the bank president waiting for us in a conference room downtown. David had arranged the meeting. "We don't need fireworks," he told me as we drove. "Just facts. Let them bury themselves with their own lies." I nodded, but inside me a storm was raging. I had imagined this confrontation 100 different ways, slamming my fist on the table, shouting down the lies, throwing their betrayal back in their faces. But when the day finally came, I felt something different. Calm. Not weakness. Calm like steel that has been tempered in fire. The conference room was larger than I expected, with a long polished table and walls of glass overlooking the city. My children were already there, my son smirking like he had already won, my daughter with that false pity in her eyes. Across from them sat the bank president, a stern man in his 60s with silver hair and a reputation for never wasting words. When David and I walked in, the atmosphere shifted. My children didn't expect me to show up. They expected to speak for me, to carry on the narrative of my incompetence while I sat quietly at home. But here I was, standing tall, folder in hand. I watched the smirk falter on my son's face, just slightly before he masked it. The bank president cleared his throat. "Mr. Harrison, we're here today to review the protective measures on your accounts. Your children have raised concerns." That's when David slid the first folder across the table. "Concerns based on falsehoods," he said firmly. "We have medical statements, financial records, and professional testimony proving Mr. Harrison's competence beyond question. What they've presented is not concern. It's misrepresentation." I opened my folder and laid out copies of the doctor's letter, the accountant's statement, and the neat stack of bills and payments spanning decades. My hands didn't shake as I did it. Instead, I felt stronger with every page that hit the table. The bank president picked up the documents, scanning them carefully. My children shifted uncomfortably, but I stayed silent, letting the weight of the truth fill the room. Then I spoke, my voice steady. "For months you've treated me like a man who can't think for himself. You've lied about me to strangers, to neighbors, even to this bank. I've been humiliated in public, whispered about in church, and pitied in my own community. But the truth is right here. I am competent. I always have been, and I will not let you take away the life I built with my own hands." The words landed heavier than any shout could have. My daughter lowered her eyes. My son leaned back, his jaw tight. The smirk was gone. David turned to the bank president. "We demand immediate reinstatement of Mr. Harrison's accounts. Furthermore, we request that the false claims filed by his children be documented as such. This is not protection, it's exploitation." The bank president looked at my children. "Do you have anything to say in response to this evidence?" For the first time, they stumbled. My daughter murmured about concern and misunderstandings. My son tried to spin it as precaution. But the more they spoke, the weaker their case sounded. They had no proof, only words, only shadows, and shadows vanish when the light shines on them. The president set the papers down. "I see no evidence that Mr. Harrison is incompetent. Quite the opposite. These documents are thorough and convincing. Effective immediately. The freeze on your accounts is lifted." The relief that washed over me in that moment wasn't just about money, it was about dignity, about reclaiming the respect they had tried to strip away. But I wasn't finished. I leaned forward, my eyes locked on my children. "You thought you could silence me. You thought you could take what I built before I was gone. But let me make this clear. You don't own me. You don't own my house, my land, or my future. I do. And from this day on, I'll decide who has access to it and who doesn't." Their faces drained of color. It wasn't anger they saw in me anymore. It was resolve. As David gathered the files, I felt lighter than I had in months. The confrontation wasn't a shouting match or a fight in the street. It was something sharper, cleaner, a reminder that truth has a weight all its own, and when placed on the table, it crushes lies without effort. Walking out of that conference room, I knew the tide had turned. My accounts were mine again, my dignity was intact, and for the first time, my children understood what they had underestimated. This wasn't the end of the war, but it was the first victory, and it was mine. When I walked out of that conference room, my stride was steady, but inside I was brimming with something I hadn't felt in months: vindication. The bank president's words still rang in my ears. Effective immediately, the freeze on your accounts is lifted. I had walked into that room as a man stripped of dignity, and I walked out having reclaimed it. But what lingered with me more than the victory itself was the look on my children's faces. Shock. They had expected me to crumble. They had built their entire plan on the idea that I was weak, confused, incapable of standing up for myself. They thought their lies had boxed me in permanently. But when truth crashed against their scheme, their expressions gave them away. For the first time, they realized their father wasn't a man to be written off. My son was the first to show it. He tried to mask it, but I saw his jaw tighten, his lips pressing into a thin line as he leaned back in his chair. He had smirked his way through the weeks leading up to this moment, acting as though he held all the cards, but now the smirk was gone. His eyes darted to the folders of evidence, to David sitting calmly at my side, and then back to me. He didn't speak, but the silence said more than words could. He wasn't supposed to fight back. My daughter was less controlled. As we left the building, she followed me into the parking lot, her voice low but trembling. "Dad, you didn't have to do all that. We were just worried about you." Worried. The word tasted bitter on my tongue. I turned to her, my face calm but my tone firm. Worried children don't file lies in banks. They don't strip their father of his independence in front of the whole town. You weren't worried. You were greedy. Her eyes welled with tears, but I didn't let them sway me. For years I had bent whenever my children needed me. I had softened when they made mistakes, forgiven when they fell short. But this wasn't a mistake. This was betrayal. In the days that followed, the ripple of their shock spread wider. Word traveled quickly in our community. People who had whispered about me being confused now came up to me in the grocery store and shook my hand. "Glad to see you're doing well, Mr. Harrison," one man said with a sheepish smile, as if he'd just realized he'd been duped. Others avoided my eyes altogether, embarrassed they had believed the rumors. My children felt that shift too. They had expected to emerge from this as protectors, caretakers of an aging man who couldn't manage on his own. Instead, they became the ones whispered about. Neighbors asked them why they had lied, why they had exaggerated, why they had turned against their father. The humiliation they had so confidently placed on me now hung around their necks. At the next family gathering, the tension was thick enough to choke on. My son tried to steer the conversation toward normalcy, talking about work and the kids, but every glance in my direction carried unspoken resentment. My daughter, on the other hand, avoided me almost entirely, speaking only when directly addressed. They couldn't hide their shock at how the balance had shifted. It wasn't just the accounts being reinstated that rattled them. It was the realization that I had done it quietly, strategically, without shouting or begging. They had believed their father was predictable, easy to manipulate. Instead, I had shown them patience sharper than any blade. That unsettled them more than any courtroom battle could have. One evening, my son cornered me after dinner. "Dad, you didn't have to make this into such a big deal. We were only trying to make sure everything was safe. You know how people your age..." I cut him off with a steady look. "People my age built the foundation you stand on. People my age worked 2 jobs so you could go to college debt-free. People my age paid for your braces, your sports, your first car. Don't talk to me like I'm a burden. I carried you when you had nothing. Don't forget it." For once, he had no answer. His mouth opened, then closed, his words failing him. Shock again, written all over his face. The beauty of truth is that it doesn't need to shout. It simply stands, and everything false crumbles around it. That was what my children were beginning to realize. They had written me off as weak, expecting me to accept their lies. Instead, I had flipped their plan on its head. But shock has another effect too. It makes people desperate, and I could see it brewing in their eyes. They weren't going to accept defeat easily. The accounts were back in my control, yes, but I knew them well enough to understand they would try again. Shock gives way to scheming, and I could almost hear the gears turning in their heads. That didn't frighten me anymore. If anything, it strengthened me, because now they knew what they were up against. No longer a silent, pitiful figure, but a father who refused to be erased, a man who had already carried heavier burdens than their greed could ever create. As I looked across the dinner table that night, at the stunned faces of the very people who thought they'd buried me, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not because the fight was over. It wasn't. But because the battlefield had shifted. They weren't the ones in control anymore. I was. And their shock was proof of it. It's one thing to win in a conference room. It's another thing entirely when the truth begins to ripple through the world outside those four walls. For months, I had walked with my head down, feeling the weight of whispered doubts. People had looked at me like I was slipping, like I was one step away from losing myself. But after the confrontation at the bank, after my accounts were restored and the lies exposed, I began to notice something remarkable. The way the world around me started to shift. It began in small ways. At the grocery store, where I used to feel eyes lingering on me, people now greeted me with genuine smiles. The cashier, who once gave me pitying looks when my card was declined, now said, "Glad to see you, Mr. Harrison. How've you been?" as if eager to erase the memory of that humiliating day. I didn't hold it against her. She had only believed what she'd been told, but the difference was clear. She saw me again, not the shadow version painted by my children's lies. At church, the change was even more noticeable. For weeks, I had endured sympathetic pats on the back, whispered prayers spoken over me as if I were already gone. Now the same people sought me out with handshakes and apologies. One man said, "We were wrong to believe the rumors. You've always been sharp as a tack. I should have known better." Another woman admitted, "Your kids had us all convinced you weren't well, but I see now, you're stronger than most of us." I didn't need their apologies to survive, but hearing them mattered. It restored something deeper than pride. It restored belonging. I was no longer the outcast father whose children had stripped him of dignity. I was again the man my community had always respected, the one they trusted to stand on his own 2 feet. The shift wasn't limited to church or the store. Around town, people who once avoided eye contact now waved as they drove by. Neighbors who had kept their distance began stopping at my fence again, asking about repairs, chatting the way they used to. Even the contractor who had walked away months earlier when I couldn't pay in cash stopped by one evening. "Heard your accounts are back in order," he said with a grin. "If you still need that fence fixed, I'll be there tomorrow." But what struck me most was how the narrative itself began to change. At first, my children's version of events had been the one people repeated, that I was slipping, confused, unable to manage. But now the story that spread was different. People spoke of me as a man wronged by his own blood, a man who fought back quietly and won. I overheard someone at the diner say, "Did you hear about Harrison? His kids tried to take his money, but he proved them wrong," sharp as ever. The lies had been loud, but the truth was louder, and the community that had once doubted me now seemed almost eager to align with me, to stand on the side of the man who had been betrayed but endured. Of course, not everyone shifted so easily. Some people clung to the narrative my children had spun, too proud to admit they'd been wrong, but even their voices grew weaker as the weeks went on. The weight of public opinion had swung in my favor, and there was no denying it. The bank president himself even called me personally one week after the meeting. His voice was formal but respectful. "Mr. Harrison, I want to apologize for the way this situation was handled. Protocol requires us to act on claims made by family members, but in hindsight, it's clear the measures were unnecessary in your case. We've updated your file. No future claims will be acted upon without substantial proof." That call meant more than he realized. It wasn't just about the accounts. It was about recognition. Recognition that I wasn't a case to be managed, but a man whose dignity mattered. My children felt the shift as well. They had expected to be seen as protectors, noble children caring for their aging father. Instead, people began to question them, to look at them with suspicion. At church, I noticed fewer conversations sparked around them. At family gatherings, cousins and relatives seemed colder toward them, their loyalty quietly tipping in my direction. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had set out to weaken me, to take away my independence by tarnishing my reputation. But in the end, their scheme only strengthened it. I had endured humiliation, yes, but I had come out of it with more respect than I had before. That shift in the community gave me more than pride. It gave me power. Not power in the form of control or wealth, but power in the form of credibility. People believed me again. They listened, and with that belief I knew I had the foundation to move forward, to rebuild not just my finances, but my place in the world they had tried to strip from me. Standing in the churchyard one Sunday morning, shaking hands with men who once doubted me, I realized something profound. Sometimes vindication doesn't come from an apology. Sometimes it comes from the quiet shift of people finally seeing the truth for themselves. And in their eyes, I was no longer the man who had been silenced. I was the man who had survived. There's a moment in every fight when the tide shifts. For months I had been drowning under lies, gasping for dignity while my children painted me as weak. But now the current had turned. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was steering the river. The first sign of real power returning came when I walked into the bank again. The same branch where the teller once told me my account was frozen. The same floor where I had been humiliated in front of strangers. This time, I didn't walk in with hesitation. I walked in with purpose. The teller looked up and smiled nervously, almost as if she remembered the scene. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," she said quickly. "Good morning," I replied, handing her my card. "I'd like to withdraw $10,000. Her eyes flickered, but she tapped at her keyboard. A moment later she slid the receipt toward me, followed by crisp bills neatly stacked. No hesitation, no manager rushing over, no whispers, just respect. As I placed the money into my leather envelope, I felt a surge of strength. This was more than cash in hand, it was proof that I was in control again. But the reversal wasn't just financial, it was psychological. At family dinners the shift was undeniable. Where once they had spoken over me, now my children spoke carefully, measuring their words. My son no longer smirked. My daughter's tone had lost its syrupy condescension. They both seemed to wait, watching for how I might respond. I didn't have to raise my voice or demand respect. It was there, unspoken, because they had seen what happened when they underestimated me. Even the smallest interactions revealed the change. When bills arrived in the mail, I opened them slowly, deliberately, sometimes in their presence. I'd write checks with a steady hand, leaving the envelopes on the table where they could see. It was a quiet demonstration, but it mattered. Every action was a reminder. I was the same man who had carried them through their childhoods, and no false narrative could erase that. The power reversal became undeniable the day the bank president called again. He didn't just apologize this time. He offered something else. "Mr. Harrison, given the circumstances, we'd like to set up a special arrangement. From now on, any claims against your accounts must be verified directly with you, in writing, and cross-checked with your attorney." That safeguard wasn't just a formality, it was recognition. It meant my children could no longer move in shadows. They could no longer write me off with a few signed papers. I was once again the gatekeeper of my life. I didn't flaunt this victory, but I let it show in the way I carried myself. I stood straighter. I looked people in the eye. I spoke with the certainty that comes when a man knows he's reclaimed what was his, and people noticed. Friends who had once pitied me now sought my advice again. Neighbors who had avoided awkward conversations now came over with questions about their own finances, remembering that I was a man who had always managed with clarity. The irony was sharp. My children had tried to strip me of power, but their scheme had given me more of it. Not only had I regained control of my accounts, but I had gained sympathy, credibility, and respect in the community. Their lies had turned into my platform. The real reversal, though, came in the subtle fear I now saw in their eyes. Fear not of me lashing out, but of me cutting them out. They had counted on my silence, on my forgiveness. Now they weren't so sure. Every glance at the documents on my desk, every time David stopped by for coffee, reminded them that I held the upper hand, and I savored it, not out of cruelty, but out of justice. For the first time in a long time, the scales were balanced. I was no longer the man they tried to bury. I was the man who had risen from the dirt with proof in one hand and resolve in the other. The power was mine again. Pride is a strange thing. When my children first plotted against me, they carried themselves like kings and queens taking the throne from a tired old man. They spoke with confidence, smiled with pity, and convinced themselves their betrayal was disguised as concern. But once the truth broke through their lies, pride began to crumble. And what took its place wasn't remorse, it was desperation. It started subtly. My daughter, who had once slowed her words as if speaking to a child, began calling more often. "Hi, Dad," she'd say in a voice too light, too rehearsed. "Just wanted to check in. How are you feeling today?" I answered plainly without warmth. "I'm fine, I always have been." There'd be a pause on the line, then a nervous laugh. "Of course, I know you are. I just, I worry sometimes. We didn't mean for everything at the bank to get out of hand." Get out of hand. That was her way of rewriting the past again, painting betrayal as a misunderstanding. I listened in silence, and my silence was heavier than any accusation. She tried to fill the void with excuses, babbling about paperwork, about how the bank must have misunderstood their intentions, but I knew the truth, and so did she. My son took a different approach. He showed up at my door one evening with a bottle of whiskey, the same brand I used to buy for special occasions. He held it out like a peace offering. "Thought we could share a drink, Dad. Like old times." I let him in, but I didn't pour the glasses. We sat at the kitchen table where I had once taught him how to balance a checkbook, how to calculate interest, how to plan for a future. Now he sat fidgeting with the bottle cap, his confidence gone. "Dad," he started, "I know things have been tense, but you have to understand, we weren't trying to hurt you. We just thought, maybe you needed help." I looked him in the eye, my voice calm. "Help doesn't come in the form of lies, son. Help doesn't strip a man of his dignity." He shifted in his chair, his face tightening. "We just thought it would be safer." I cut him off. "Safer for who?" "Safer for you to get your hands on what isn't yours yet." He didn't answer. His silence was answer enough. The backpedaling grew bolder after the community began to side with me. My children realized they weren't just losing control of my accounts. They were losing the respect of everyone around them. Neighbors whispered. Relatives asked questions they couldn't answer. At the next family gathering, my son's voice cracked as he tried to justify himself to cousins. "We only did it because Dad seemed tired. We thought we were protecting him." But protection doesn't need to be justified if it's real. Only betrayal needs excuses, and their excuses multiplied with every passing day. One night my daughter came over with her kids. She stood in my living room wringing her hands, her eyes glassy. "Dad, I know we messed up, but can't we just move past it? We're still family. The kids miss you." The words hit me hard. I loved my grandchildren, but love for them didn't erase the truth of what their mother had done. "I'll never stop being their grandfather," I said firmly. "But you chose your path. You tried to take away my independence. You'll have to live with that." She began to cry then, real tears this time. But tears weren't apologies. Tears weren't accountability. They were just another attempt to soften the edges of betrayal. And still, they begged in different ways. My son offered to help with repairs around the house. My daughter insisted on cooking meals and dropping them off. They framed these gestures as kindness, but I knew what they were. Desperate attempts to step back into my life, to prove they still had influence over me. But here's the truth about betrayal. Once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. Once someone shows you the price they're willing to pay for greed, you never forget. I accepted their food, their offers, their calls, but not as reconciliation. I accepted them as reminders of how far they had fallen, because the begging wasn't really about me, it was about them, about their fear of being cut off, of being written out, of losing what they had tried to steal. They weren't sorry for what they had done, they were sorry they had failed. The power reversal was complete in those moments. I didn't have to raise my voice, didn't have to lecture or punish. Their desperation was punishment enough. They once thought I was weak, but now they hovered, nervous and uncertain, waiting for my response. And the more they begged, the stronger I became. For years, I had carried them on my back. I had forgiven every mistake, softened every blow. But this time, I let them feel the weight of their own choices. No quick forgiveness, no sweeping it under the rug, just the reality of what betrayal costs. Because in their desperation, I finally saw the truth. I no longer needed them to see me as strong. They needed me, and that, more than anything, was justice. There comes a point when anger cools, when humiliation fades, and when even victory isn't enough. What remains is clarity. I had fought to restore my dignity and control, and I had won. My accounts were back in my hands, the lies had been exposed, and the community once again looked at me with respect. But battles are temporary. Closure is permanent. And I knew I needed closure. Not through revenge, not through shouting, but through action so final that no one could ever strip me of my independence again. That's when I decided it was time to change everything. My will, my power of attorney, my estate plans. For years I had left everything tied neatly to my children. It was natural. Parents dream of passing down what they've built, of leaving behind security for their bloodline, but they had made their choice. They had shown me what they valued most. Not me, not family, but money. And so I made mine. I called David, my lawyer, and told him exactly what I wanted. "I don't want them having a single ounce of legal authority over me," I said firmly. "No access to my accounts, no control over my property, no role in my future." David leaned back in his chair, studying me with a quiet respect. "That's a serious decision," he said. "Once we change these documents, the message will be loud and clear." "Good," I replied. "It's time they heard it." The following week, I sat across from David as he laid out the new paperwork. One by one, I signed documents revoking every legal tie that gave my children control. Power of attorney, gone. Any medical decision rights, gone. I replaced them with trusted alternatives. A lifelong friend for financial oversight if needed, and a retired neighbor I respected deeply for emergency medical decisions. People who had never once betrayed me. People who valued me as a man, not as a bank account. When it came to my will, I hesitated for a long moment. The original draft had left nearly everything to my son and daughter. The house, the land, the savings. Carol and I had made that plan years earlier when we believed love and loyalty were unshakable. Now those assumptions were dust. Instead, I redirected the bulk of my estate into a trust for my grandchildren's education. They were innocent, and I wouldn't punish them for their parents' greed. As for my son and daughter, I left them something small, a token, just enough to make sure they couldn't claim I had forgotten them. But the message was unmistakable. They were no longer the heirs to my life's work. When I signed the final page, I felt something lift from my shoulders. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even anger. It was freedom. The same kind of freedom I'd felt years earlier when I finally paid off my house, when I knew no bank or creditor could hold it over me. This time, the freedom wasn't from debt. It was from betrayal. A week later, I invited my children over. They came, still cautious, still speaking with careful tones as though I might explode. But I wasn't angry. I was calm. We sat in the living room, and I placed a folder on the coffee table between us. "I've made changes," I said simply. My daughter frowned. "What kind of changes?" "My will, my power of attorney, my estate." Their faces drained of color almost instantly. My son reached for the folder, but I pulled it back. "You don't need to see the details. You just need to understand this. You no longer have control. You no longer decide for me. And when the time comes, what I've built will go where it belongs, not into greedy hands, but into ones that still know what family means." My daughter's lip trembled. "Dad, please, you don't have to do this. We made mistakes, but we're still your children." I looked at her, my voice steady. "Children don't try to strip their father of dignity. Children don't lie to the world to take what isn't theirs. You stopped being just my children the day you did that. From then on, you became something else. People I can't trust." My son leaned forward, his voice sharper. "So what? You're cutting us off? After everything you've done for us? After everything Mom wanted?" I met his glare calmly. "Your mother wanted you to have better lives than we had. She didn't want you to steal mine while I was still breathing." The room went silent. They had no reply. That moment wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about revenge. It was closure. By stripping their power legally, by removing them from my plans, I had ended their grip on me. They could no longer control me with lies, no longer play the role of caretakers while stealing my independence. When they left that night, their shoulders sagged. They didn't slam doors or raise voices. They walked out quietly, their silence louder than any argument. They understood the message. As I sat alone in the quiet house afterward, I looked at Carol's photo on the mantel. For the first time in months, I felt I had honored her memory. She had stood by me through every sacrifice, every hardship, every battle we fought together. She would never have wanted me to hand our life's work to those who betrayed me. Closure doesn't always come with forgiveness. Sometimes it comes with a pen, a signature, and the calm certainty that the past can't repeat itself. That night, I slept better than I had in years, because the chapter was closed, not with rage but with resolve. There's a kind of silence that hangs in the air when truth finally settles. It isn't loud. It isn't triumphant. It's steady, like the stillness after a storm when the wind has no more fight left in it. That was the silence I lived in after I closed the chapter on my children's control. My dignity had been restored, my future secured, and yet one thing remained absent: an apology. I never got one. Not from my son, not from my daughter. They called less often now. When they did, their words were clipped, cautious, as if they were afraid of saying the wrong thing. They visited with their children, yes, but the old warmth between us had cooled into something transactional, a performance of family rather than the real thing. They would smile at me in front of the grandchildren, but their eyes told a different story. Resentment, fear, maybe even guilt, but never remorse. At first I waited for it. A part of me, deep down, wanted to hear them say the words, "We're sorry, we were wrong," but days turned into weeks and weeks into months, and I realized that apology was never coming. Instead, what I got was recognition. Recognition not from them, but from everyone else. At church, the pastor pulled me aside one Sunday. "You know, Mr. Harrison," he said, placing a firm hand on my shoulder, "I've always admired your strength, but these last months, you've shown us what resilience looks like. A lot of people would have crumbled under what you went through. You stood tall. Neighbors stopped me on the street, not with pity anymore, but with respect. Heard what happened with the bank," one man said, shaking his head. "Never seen anyone handle betrayal with as much composure as you did. Even the bank itself, the very place where I'd been humiliated, now treated me differently. The staff greeted me by name. The manager who once spoke to me like I was fragile now spoke with crisp deference, as if eager to make up for the slight. My new safeguards were honored without question. When I walked through those doors, there were no whispers, no hesitation, only acknowledgement that I was a man in full command of his life. And in those moments I realized something powerful. Respect doesn't always come from the people who owe it to you. Sometimes it comes from the world watching, from those who recognize strength even if it isn't acknowledged by family. Still, the absence of an apology from my children lingered. They tried to act as though nothing had happened, as though their attempt to strip me of independence was some unfortunate misunderstanding we could sweep under the rug. But I refused to play along. I didn't lash out, didn't demand contrition. I simply carried myself with the dignity they had tried to erase. and in doing so I reminded them every day that my worth didn't depend on their approval. At a family gathering one evening, my son tried to make a joke at my expense, something he might have gotten away with months ago when he believed the lies he told about me. "Careful, Dad," he said with a forced laugh. "Don't forget your keys again." The room went quiet. All eyes turned to me, waiting for a reaction. I met his gaze calmly and said, "The only thing I'll never forget is who tried to take my life away from me." He laughed nervously, muttered something about just kidding, but the message was clear. The power dynamic had shifted permanently. I didn't need to yell. My composure was stronger than any outburst, and the family, watching in silence, saw it too. The recognition that mattered most wasn't spoken in grand speeches. It was in the small things, the way people no longer second-guessed me, the way they sought my advice again, asked my opinion on matters, and treated me as a man whose judgment was sound. My competence, my independence, my place in the community, those had all been restored. My children may never give me the apology I deserve. They may never admit the full extent of what they did, or the pain it caused. But in truth, I no longer needed it. Their silence was its own confession, and every look they gave me, every nervous shift in their tone, every time they avoided the subject, it all screamed louder than any apology could. They knew. One evening as I sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I thought about Carol. I imagined her sitting beside me, her hand resting gently on mine. She would have hated the betrayal. She would have cried over the fracture in the family, but she would have smiled to see me standing tall again, not as a man broken, but as a man rebuilt. In that quiet, I understood something important. Dignity isn't granted by others. It isn't handed to you by apologies or acknowledgments. Dignity is claimed, and once you reclaim it, no one can take it away, not even those closest to you. Recognition had returned to me, even if apologies had not, and that was enough. When the dust finally settled, I found myself standing at a crossroads. The accounts were mine again. The community respected me again. The lies had been silenced, and the betrayal had been confronted. But as I sat in the quiet of my house looking at the photo of Carol on the mantel, I realized victory alone wasn't enough. Winning back what was stolen was one thing. Deciding what to do with it was another. I had a choice. I could let bitterness consume me, live the rest of my days reminding my children of their betrayal, clinging to anger like a weapon, or I could carve out something new, something that spoke not of betrayal but of resilience. I chose the latter. The first step was with my grandchildren. They were innocent in all of this, too young to understand the greed that had driven their parents. To them I was just grandpa, the man who used to buy them ice cream, fix their bikes, and tell stories on the porch. I decided I wouldn't let their parents' mistakes taint that bond, so I started a tradition. Sunday afternoons at my house. No excuses, no cancellations. I picked them up myself if I had to. We cooked simple meals together, planted vegetables in the backyard, played old board games Carol used to love. I opened a special account, a trust in their names, dedicated to their education and future. It wasn't about money alone. It was about teaching them the value of responsibility. Every time they helped me in the yard or read a book with me, I told them, this is how you build a life, not by taking from others but by working with your own two hands. Their laughter filled the house again, a sound I hadn't heard since Carol was alive. And in those moments I realized my true legacy wasn't in the accounts or the deeds. It was in the lessons I passed on, the values I planted like seeds. Beyond family, I found myself drawn back into the community. People who once whispered about me now sought me out for advice. Younger men came by the shop asking how to manage money, how to balance hard work with family. I started meeting them every Wednesday at the diner, buying the first round of coffee and sharing what I'd learned. Not just about money but about endurance, about surviving storms without losing yourself. It surprised me how much fulfillment came from those conversations. For years I had poured myself into providing for my children, assuming they would carry on my values. But when they chose greed, I realized the lessons didn't have to end with them. A legacy isn't bound by blood alone, it's carried by anyone who listens and learns. One evening, sitting on the porch after a long day, I thought about everything I had endured, being stripped of dignity, being pitied, humiliated, betrayed, and yet, here I was, not broken, but stronger. I hadn't just reclaimed what was mine. I had built something greater, a future where my story wasn't defined by betrayal, but by how I rose after it. I made one final decision, a private one. In my revised will, I included a letter, not a scathing note, not a list of grievances, but a simple truth. I wrote, "You tried to take from me what I spent my life building. You thought lies could erase decades of sacrifice, but dignity can't be stolen. It can only be surrendered, and I never surrendered. My legacy is not yours to rewrite. It belongs to those who will honor it, not exploit it." I don't know if my children will ever read those words with understanding, but that's not the point. The point is that the truth will outlive me, written plainly in my own hand. In the meantime, I live with peace. I walk into the bank without fear. I mow my lawn while neighbors wave. I sit in the church pew, knowing the whispers are no longer about confusion but about strength. I laugh with my grandchildren. I mentor the young men at the diner. I breathe freely in my own home, surrounded not by suspicion but by the quiet dignity of a man who refused to be erased. My new path is clear. I no longer measure my life by what was taken but by what I've reclaimed and what I continue to give. And my new legacy isn't just money in accounts or names on deeds. It's the story of a man who faced betrayal from within his own family, endured humiliation, and still stood tall. Because in the end, legacy isn't about what you leave in the bank, it's about what you leave in the hearts of those who come after you. And mine will be this: resilience, dignity, and the unshakable truth that no one, not even family, can rewrite the life I built.